This program is brought to you by Emory University.
All right, well, I've got 3:10, and so out of respect, attempts to stay consistent with the agenda and to honor the time of our speakers, go ahead and get us back started. So please resume your seats, and we'll resume the program. As we sort of turn the corner, really, for the late afternoon stretch, thank you for staying with us. Continue to give you some really great information, but really to expand the lens with this next panel to look at these issues of human trafficking from the international context. So with us again briefly with reference to their biographical information that's in the materials, I'll turn this over to our moderator, Ambassador Susan Koeppen, who we've been introduced to and are so glad to have here. She is the Ambassador at Large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons and the Senior Advisor to the Secretary of State. To her right is Aliyah El-Sawi, Victim Assistance Specialist with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security Investigations. Then Catherine Hoffer, the Assistant U.S. Attorney, for the Northern District of Georgia. And then we have Daniel Werner, Senior Supervising Attorney with the Southern Poverty Law Center. And rounding out the panel, Shinji Morikuma, Program Director, Office of Court Professionals, Administrative Office of the Courts. Some really long titles. They've earned every bit of it. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
So we're going to talk, am I on? I don't sound, oh, there I am. Now I hear. We're going to talk about labor trafficking this afternoon, which is kind of the forgotten stepchild of trafficking. Everybody thinks about sex trafficking, particularly sex trafficking of minors. Actually, globally, the number is about 3 to 1 in terms of the number of labor trafficking victims as compared to sex trafficking victims. And the ILO, the International Labor Organization, estimates that there are about 14 million people worldwide being trafficked for labor, and only about 4.5 victims of sexual exploitation. So it's in every country that's looking at this, it focuses on the sex trafficking first. It certainly moves our hearts when we hear about those cases. And labor trafficking can also be a little grayer in terms of what is labor trafficking. And Camilla shared the definition with you this morning, but it again is the federal definition is force, fraud, or coercion. The state definition was coercion or deception to cause someone to engage in work they don't want to. But the reason it's gray is because there's a whole continuum in labor trafficking. There can be labor exploitation where you violate someone's wage and hour rights. There can be hazardous working conditions that still aren't labor trafficking. But when someone is compelled to work, that can rise to the definition of labor trafficking. So there are harder cases to find, and they're also harder for investigators, prosecutors, and judges to think about, because oftentimes it involves someone who wants to work and who wants to work in the job they're working in, and then the situation gets changed on them. Again, that's that fraud and deception, and you're going to hear examples of that from all of our panelists today. Industries that you can think about labor trafficking happening in, obviously agriculture, farm workers, manufacturing. There have been some cases in the U.S. with janitorial services and cleaning in hotels, hospitality industry and hotels, construction, which Dan will talk about later, shipyards as well, restaurants, health and elder care is a growing concern because of our aging population here and in other countries, salon services such as nails, fairs and carnivals, and even like street begging or door-to-door sales, crews of kids selling magazines or candies or something. That can also be a forced labor situation. So those are all just to try to get us thinking about that. The National Human Trafficking Resource Center has reported 128 cases of human trafficking in Georgia so far this year. And that's what gets called into the number. Obviously, there are many more. And the majority of these are sex trafficking cases. Again, I think it's also harder for victims to understand what their rights are and that they may be victims of labor trafficking. And so we'll talk about that failure to identify among the panelists as well. But out of those 128 cases, 25 were incidents of labor trafficking. And when you call into the National Resource Hotline, the trafficking number, they ask you what you're working in. And what they heard from Georgia, again, was agriculture, construction, forestry, landscaping, and in factories. So I think the Georgia courts will start to see more of these cases. We have seen a few in federal court here, in domestic servitude, which Kathy will talk about. And I just wanted to give that kind of brief overview as we start talking about labor trafficking. Shinji is going to talk about some of the obligations that judges have with respect to non-English speaking victims, because many labor trafficking and sex trafficking victims don't speak English at all, or certainly not as their first language. And so as we encounter these individuals who may be migrating here for economic opportunities, the courts do have an obligation to them to make sure that they have access to justice, even if they broke U.S. immigration laws in coming into the country.
Thank you. This is, Georgia judges should already know this, so this is a reminder, but I'm also here to inform the people who appear before judges to make sure that they understand what services people are entitled to when they appear in court, in state court in Georgia. Under federal law, state law, federal and state case law, people who are limited English proficient, that's a technical term for people who are just not very good at speaking English. Those folks, people who are deaf and hard of hearing, they are entitled to be provided a qualified interpreter by the court at no charge to them or their attorneys, by the way. We've seen people try to pass that off to the attorneys. They're entitled to those interpretive services free of charge in criminal cases, which seems to be easy for people to understand, but also civil cases. So pretty much any court proceeding, any court hearing, any court service, people are entitled, limited English people, and proficient people, and deaf, hard of hearing people are entitled to be provided a qualified interpreter by the court when they ask for one at no charge to them. It's relatively simple, but we try to repeat that message over and over because we do hear instances, even in sometimes when victims appear for temporary restraining order hearings, those cases, extraordinary cases, we hear that people are being denied interpretive services. So to remind folks, up in the check-in desk, I'll point you to these two bench cards, double-sided, laminated. One is for working with limited English proficient persons and foreign language interpreters in the courtroom. That's the blue one, and the green one is for deaf, hard of hearing people and sign language interpreters. This is a quick reference guide for judges, but it is also useful for all of you who appear before judges as advocates. Please read that. Please take these and keep them handy. Hand them out to anyone who may encounter these kinds of issues. They're also posted on the Georgia Supreme Court Commission on Interpreters website, coi.georgiacourts.gov, if you wanted an electronic form. I think it was also included in your electronic materials for today. But please just remember, anytime somebody needs an interpreter, they're entitled to one, and a qualified one, and they're entitled to one without being charged for it. It's as simple as that. We know fairness, the law requires it, fairness requires it, of course, due process requires it. So please remember that and keep that in mind. If you're denied interpretive services in the state court in Georgia, you can call us and we'll work with you to make sure that that gets cleared up. So that's my job. If you come away with nothing else, and I'm sure you'll come away with lots of things, please remember, interpretive services, language support, people are entitled to them under law.
So with respect to labor trafficking, I ran down some of the industries and areas where it can happen. And in the cases that we first started encountering here in the federal court, they were all domestic servitude. So people brought here to be nannies or maids or to work in someone's home. And for me, until I took the job I have now, I thought there can be nothing more isolating than being trafficked within a home, right? Because you don't interact with individuals really except your trafficker or who your trafficker allows you to see. On a side note, since I've had this job, I've decided that forced fishing at sea, thousands of miles from land, might be a bit more isolating than domestic servitude, and that is a huge problem globally, so my lens has been expanded. But both of those, you can imagine how isolating that experience would be. And you tend to traffic your own. So the cases we had here that Kathy's going to talk about involve, the first one was an Indian family who brought in a young woman from India. The ones that Kathy and I are going to talk about were the Nigerian and someone from the Kingdom of Swaziland, who again brought in someone from their own country. So there were all kinds of cultural tools that were also being used to force the victims to work in ways they didn't want to. But Kathy, if you could talk about the cases we've had here.
Sure. And the difference between the two is that in one, physical abuse was used to keep the victims in the home and force them to stay there as opposed to try to run away. And in another, it was mostly manipulation, creating a climate of fear instead of physical abuse. So the first case is the Babbs, Juna and Michael Babb, who lived in the Northern District of Georgia. And they went to the Kingdom of Swaziland in Africa, where they had family, knew people, and presented themselves to be business people, wealthy Americans, and convinced a young woman to come back and help them at their son's wedding. And also they claimed to be ministers. So they had a lot of gratis with the people who didn't really know who they were and were impressed with this facade. So they convinced this young woman to come back and help with their son's wedding, saying that she would be paid as a cook and to help serve at this wedding. And she had never been out of her country. She had no friends or relatives in the United States, and so was first reluctant to leave, but they convinced her that this was going to be so lucrative that she agreed to do it. So once she, and the Babbs created false documents to support her visitor's visa to the United States, and they also coached her in what to say were she to be interviewed about why she was coming into the country. So they told her to lie, they made fake documents, and then once she got into the country, they took away all of her documents and said, well, there's really no wedding, but you're going to be our housekeeper and nanny. So she didn't know anybody, she didn't speak English, she had no documents because they took them away. And they threatened to call the police and report her to immigration and threatened her with deportation consistently so that she would be afraid and live in fear of them, which she did for a couple of years. So then I think at a time when her passport actually expired or her visa, then they threatened her with calling DHS, INS, whatever it's called now, ICE. It's been through so many evolutions. And she had nothing. She had no one to turn to in the country. So, and then they told her she was illegal, and she was very afraid. So that was a huge problem, and I don't know if y'all have encountered anything like this. As opposed to physical labor, the climate of fear, the vulnerable victim, the reasons that people stay in these situations and are unable to escape. They also told her that if she tried to go out of the house, that she was going to be murdered because their neighborhood was very dangerous. So, and this poor woman came from living in a shack to living in this big house up in Gwinnett County that appeared very nice neighborhood. It didn't just appear nice, it was nice. But she was forced to babysit their grandchild and be their servant, and they would hire her out to do services for other people and say they were going to give her the money, but they never gave her the money. So she was stuck there, and she did manage to escape through friends of the Babbs. And the Babbs even would say to other friends of theirs in her presence, you should also go get a cheap maid from Africa. And so they were actually capitalizing on their own country people and their own fellow Nigerians to take advantage of them. And she was ultimately rescued by some friends of theirs who recognized that she was ultimately a slave. And they were charged with several offenses: forced labor, document servitude, harboring an alien for financial gain, false statements made to federal agents when they were interviewed because they denied it until the end, although they did end up pleading guilty. So the next case is the Bellows from Nigeria. Same situation. They went to Nigeria, where they were from, and convinced two different young women at different times to return to the United States with them to work as a nanny and a maid. So one victim was only 17, and the Bellows had gotten a fraudulent British passport and brought her in under that, and also had fake documents created to obtain her visa. So the Bellows promised her that she would be sent to school and that they would pay her a salary to be the maid and the babysitter. But of course, they did not do any of that. They did not send her to school. They did not pay her, and they physically abused her and treated them inhumanely. Mostly the wife, she would beat this woman and the woman that came after her with a wooden spoon, with shoes, with an electric cord, and her hands to inflict the physical abuse. And one of the young women actually managed to take pictures of herself with a disposable camera for use later on. They were both made to sleep on a floor or on a couch, even though the house had many bedrooms. They were forced to cook for the Bellows, but then they would not let the two young women actually eat the food they had cooked, that they made them eat some kind of cheaper food or even no food. So they did as much as they could to keep these women in their control, and it worked for a while. So these women were ultimately rescued, and I'm going to go back to Susan to talk about how they were rescued.
Yeah, so particularly the Nigerian case, which I actually prosecuted, she spoke English. And she was here in the U.S. For almost a year and didn't realize that she was a victim of a crime. It was just not even on her radar. And I love this story because to me, it's about getting the word out and getting the message out to our communities and citizens who may see this. She was just watching an episode of Law and Order, and she realized she was a trafficking victim from watching that episode, right? I mean, TV, whew. And she saved up some money. Some of Bellows' friends would tip her for work she did for them. She saved up some money. She called a cab. She was in Gwinnett County, and the cab comes, and he's like, "Where do you want to go?" And she had no idea about the community, but she'd heard of Marietta. So she said, "I want to go to Marietta." He said, "Where in Marietta do you want to go?" And she said, "A church." So he took her to a Methodist church in Marietta where she talked to an associate pastor, and the pastor recognized that she was also a victim of a crime. So the fact that this awareness has seeped into our community, Attorney General Owens talked about going to churches. This church knew what to do and referred her to the FBI for help. So the first victim had just been absorbed into the Nigerian community. She didn't know she had rights, which allowed Badimi Bello to go back to Nigeria and get another victim. And I fully believe that if the second victim hadn't realized that she had rights, there would have been a third and a fourth victim. So it's really, really great that she was able to get help. And one of the things we do in cases for foreign-born victims is we give them the rights to stay in this country, to assist in trials, and if they follow the laws, they can be on a path to U.S. citizenship. And that's where Aaliyah and Homeland Security come in, because that law is set up and administered through the Department of Homeland Security. And I would like Aaliyah to talk about how she helped these victims. I will say that Bello fled, and so there wasn't even a case to proceed with, but they were still entitled to the services.
Thank you, Susan. Good afternoon. So in these types of cases, the labor trafficking cases, there are certainly resources available for the victims of this crime. And I'm sure you heard about some of the resources available for sex trafficking survivors earlier in the day, but some of those resources are the same, not only in Georgia, but throughout the country for labor trafficking victims. So those services include shelter, food, clothing, mental health services, medical needs, basically any type of holistic needs the victims may have at that time. And there's also legal services, which is a big component. As Susan mentioned, a lot of these victims that we're working with are undocumented. And so there's a specific visa called the T visa, which many of you may have heard of, and that is specific for trafficking victims. It's inclusive of sex and labor trafficking, adult and juvenile victims, male and female. So just to talk a little bit about the T visa, I'm not sure how much you heard about it earlier in the day, and my apologies if, okay, great. So the T visa, as I mentioned, is a specific visa for trafficking victims. Adults or juveniles are able to apply for this visa. The visa has certain requirements. First of all, you have to be considered an undocumented victim of severe form of trafficking. And by severe form of trafficking, again, it may fall under labor or under sex. The victim, if they're an adult, also has to be willing to cooperate with law enforcement. And that could be just throughout the investigative period. It could be through a series of interviews, just basically cooperating with the with whatever law enforcement needs at that time to move forward with the case. There's also a piece of the T visa that's very important for a lot of you in the audience to recognize that there's something called a T visa supplemental B. It's also referred to as the I-914B. And in the resources that you all will receive after the conference is over, I've included a copy of that and what that looks like. And basically it's 2 to 3 pages. The certification is something that can be signed by either the law enforcement officer or agent that is investigating the case. It can be signed off by the prosecutor. It can even be signed off by a judge. So many of you in the audience that are judges, you too can sign off on the certification. The certification just simply says that the victim has indeed cooperated during the investigation. The case doesn't have to go into full prosecution in order for an individual to sign off on the certification. It could be just a case that got referred but didn't, maybe the defendant pled or it didn't quite make it to trial. It's basically not necessary for the prosecution to occur in order for the certification to be signed. So the T visa is really a great tool for these victims. As Susan mentioned, they are undocumented, and in order for them to get on and move past their victimization, there are certain things that they need here in the United States, such as their legal and immigration rights. Is there anything else that I'm forgetting in terms of specific to these victims that we worked with their T visa?
Well, the other one is in the BAB case, which was not mine. The victim went back to Swaziland. That's where she wanted to go.
So with the victims, it's some victims decide to go back to their home country and some decide to stay here. So certainly if they decide to return back to their home country, we try to coordinate that. We work a lot with International Organization for Migration so that they are reintegrated back into their home country. But if they decide to stay here and pursue the T visa, it's helpful in the fact that if they have family members, say for instance, in these cases, I know with the BAB case, her husband, for instance, was still in Swaziland. So in a case like that, she could apply for her husband for a T visa as well. If there are any kids, you can apply for your kids as derivatives for the T visa. If it's a child victim that has been victimized either in labor or sex, they can apply for their parents, they can apply for their spouse, and they can apply for their siblings. So there are derivatives that are available for those victims. Also with the T visa, one other thing I'd like to mention is that if they do decide to pursue it, the requirements are a little bit different. You're not typically supposed to go back to your home country when the T visa is pending, because then you're showing that you may not have fear of returning back home, which is one of the requirements is showing that there is some type of reasonable fear of returning back to your home country.
So, and if you start to hear these cases in state court, just as Dahlia mentioned earlier, we tell the full story about these individuals. So a common defense tactic is you wanted to come here, you knew that the documents you were traveling under weren't yours, weren't valid, you knew you'd overstayed your visa, you know, you're living in this beautiful house. So you hear these things put forward, and so as a former prosecutor, we would always want to tell that full story, so much so that in the Bellows case, we brought the mother and father over to testify so they could tell the jury what their daughter had been promised, what had induced her to travel here, and what lies they had been told. Again, going back to that fraud and deception element. So it was really important that judges and juries understand the perspective of trafficking from the victim, because that's what the law allows, as the victim would see it. And as a little point of privilege being the moderator, I have worked with now some international law enforcement, and there was a police officer from Cyprus who told me she was being cross-examined, and the defense was saying, well, this victim was free to go, she was free to walk out the door, she was free to go tell the neighbors. And the policewoman said, in your world, yes, in her world, no. And it's the her world perspective, or the his world, that we need to be looking at this from. I wanted to bring in a civil case as well, because you might see those before you see criminal cases. And so I called Dan recently and said, can you please come and give this perspective? Because as a judge, you may hear a contract dispute or a wage and hour violation or even a sexual harassment case that actually has trafficking components behind it. And Dan, if you'll talk about, too, the indicators that are common, Kathy touched on them to start, but the indicators across both civil and criminal cases that can lead to trafficking. And as a prosecutor storyteller, I'm so jealous of Dan's case. It's awesome. So with that set up.
Thank you. You'll note that I'm starting my timer because I'm notoriously bad at sticking to a time. I'm going to actually start very briefly telling a story that from a few months before the trial, which I'll also talk about later. We did a mock jury exercise in this case that I'll be talking about. This is the first mock jury exercise I'd worked on. And both sides did their Koeppenings, as we call them. We had a pro bono law firm that was presenting the case from the defendant's perspective for this mock jury, and then we presented the plaintiff's perspective. And then, you know, what's great about a mock jury exercise, of course, is that you get to watch the jurors deliberate through closed-circuit TV. The panel that I was observing, the person who decided that he would be the foreperson, stood up and took a deep breath and said, "I've seen Taken. This is not trafficking." And that was really important for us to hear as we were preparing for trial, because the people who are on juries are people who have seen Taken. They may have looked up trafficking on the internet. And if you do a Google Images search for human trafficking, which I would encourage you to do, almost all of the images show people in shackles or chains or behind bars. You have to scroll down about 5 pages before you see a single image of an adult male. And in our case, we were representing essentially 500 adult males. So that was important in terms of how we framed our case. And I think it was really the judge in our case, to her great credit, I think also really understood forced labor. And the jury instructions that she ultimately presented were people often aren't sure what that means. The jury instructions really reflected very, very accurately what the law says forced labor is, rather than what popular culture thinks forced labor is. So that was a very important process. The story of Signal starts with Hurricane Katrina, which not only obviously devastated a lot of the Gulf Coast, but also severely damaged a lot of oil rigs in the Gulf. Signal International was a company that was in the business of repairing oil rigs, so this was a potential boon for them. At the same time, they were faced with having to use contract labor to work these repair jobs because some of their workforce had been displaced as a result of the storm. Along came a recruiter who also moonlighted as a police officer in southern Mississippi, who said to Signal, I can get you 500 skilled welders and fitters from India, and they'll be direct hires. You won't have to pay contract labor rates, and it won't cost you a penny to bring them. And Signal didn't do a lot of research. They jumped on the opportunity. They did the math. Our expert did the math during trial and calculated that they stood to save about $22 million by bringing in this workforce. So they did it. And they worked with this recruiter in Mississippi, a recruiter in India, and a recruiter in, and an attorney in Louisiana, an immigration attorney, to recruit these workers. This group of people, the two recruiters and the attorney, placed ads in newspapers in India and in the United Arab Emirates, where a lot of Indian welders work as guest workers, saying you can get green cards if, to work in the United States. This is a great opportunity. Come to these seminars, and we'll tell you all about them. The prospective workers came to these seminars, again, learned about these promises of green cards, were shown a slideshow of the Signal facilities, the yard, and it looked fabulous. And they were told, but it's going to cost you something, and the amounts varied and increased over time, which is often a telltale sign of fraud if the recruitment fees increase. It's going to cost you $10,000, $12,000. Towards the end, people were paying as much as $20,000 or more. But these men saw it as a really potentially life-changing opportunity for them. It was green cards for themselves and for their families, is what was promised. And so they came up with the money. Most of them borrowed a tremendous amount of money sometimes from sort of some unsavory characters and loan sharks in India. Some sold family jewelry, which is culturally very important in India, is passed down from generation to generation. Some put up family land for this opportunity. They eventually learned that they weren't going to go to the United States with green cards. They were going to go to the United States with H-2B guest worker visas. These are temporary seasonal visas. For those of you who are familiar with immigration law, it's the opposite of a green card. A green card is lawful permanent, emphasis on permanent residency. H-2B is temporary. It's a non-immigrant visa. You have to have non-immigrant intent. It means you don't intend to stay. The recruiters were worried about this and coached the workers what to say in their consular interviews. Because if any of the workers said, we're coming to get green cards, it could put in jeopardy the entire scheme. The workers, and forgive, I'm giving a very abbreviated version. The workers showed up after paying this tremendous amount of money. And there are incredible stories people tell of riding their bicycles through the streets of Chennai with the equivalent of thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars worth of rupees in cash in a duffel bag strapped to the back of their bike, just hoping that they could get to where they're going without getting robbed so they could pay these fees. They showed up and they had expectations about what the housing would be. The contract, the recruitment document said that housing would be provided. When they arrived, really, a lot of them felt, as soon as they stepped into the labor camp, they lost all hope. This was a labor camp with a series of converted shipping containers that had been turned into bunk houses. 22 or 24 people living in each bunkhouse, with the bunks smushed together head to head, side to side, sometimes with only a couple feet to walk between the bunks. It was surrounded by a chain link fence. There was a gate. Belongings were searched when they came and left. And for the privilege of living in this labor camp, they were told that they would have $1,050 a month deducted from their wages. Signal did tell them that they did not have to live in this labor camp, which is something Signal talked about at trial and talked about to DOJ. But they would still have the money deducted from their paychecks. So really, it was not a real choice. They could not afford to both pay rent in the community and have the $1,050 deducted from their wages. They were also assigned to some of the most dangerous jobs in these rigs. If you picture an oil rig, what you see is above ground. Above the water. The most dangerous jobs are actually in the bowels of the ship, below the water level, where there's often standing water. They're doing electric welds, sometimes lying in standing water, reaching around corners. This was incredibly dangerous work, and they were assigned the most dangerous jobs. Little by little, they became very frustrated with their situation. They also started to occur to them that they weren't going to get the green cards that had been promised. Some of the workers got together at a local Catholic church, where, similar to the case that you mentioned, the priest understood the predicament that they were in and put them in touch with attorneys, including attorneys at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Word got back to Signal that workers had been talking. And Signal's reaction, rather than say, okay, well, let's try to deal with this situation productively, Signal decided that they needed to teach the workers a lesson. And this all came out, there are about 2.5 million documents that we received through discovery in the case. And a lot of this was reflected in emails and other documents that we received. The way Signal decided that they would teach them a lesson was to have a roundup at a time in the morning when all the workers, all the shifts were in the labor camp. They found their most burly guards, gave them pictures of the men who were leading this effort to raise concerns about their conditions. The guards walked around the labor camp with the pictures and picked up the men one by one and put them in one of the shipping containers. One of the men was so distraught about the prospect of being forced to return to India, because they were rounding them up and told them and everybody else in the labor camp that they were going to be forcibly deported, was so distraught about having to return to India to debts he would never be able to repay, that he slit his wrists. And a lot of the workers talk about the moment when they saw him being carried across the labor camp covered with blood, howling with grief. That's the only way to describe it. He survived, fortunately, was rushed to the hospital. But that did serve as a warning to many of the workers that they needed to keep their heads down and put up with the conditions. They couldn't leave. They couldn't leave for a number of reasons, and they had to put up with their conditions. But one thing with guest worker visas that's really important is that the name of the employer is actually stamped on their visa. So unlike most people who participate in the free market of labor, if you don't like your employer, you're stuck there, or you have to return home. The alternative is to become undocumented, which isn't a tenable option either. So most of them decided to keep their heads down and keep working. Little by little, they trickled out, and then we filed our lawsuit a year after this roundup. We filed as a class action on behalf of the 500 workers. After a few years of discovery and motion practice around class action, the judge denied class certification for reasons I'm happy to go into later if people have questions. We, respectfully disagree with the judge, with the judge's position, but that was the reality of the case. Signal thought the case would go away, that, it had gone from a 500-person case to a 12-plaintiff case. But we felt like it was really important for all the workers who wanted to have legal representation, who wanted to pursue the case, to have lawyers who would do it. So we engaged in a strong effort to find pro bono firms to represent them. In the end, we were able to, some of the top law firms in the country, Latham & Watkins, Skadden Arps, McDermott, Will & Emery, from here in Atlanta, Sutherland and Kilpatrick, and a number of other really terrific firms came on board to represent groups of workers. In the end, about 250 workers were represented in their individual cases against Signal, which wasn't what Signal expected. The cases were filed in Louisiana, federal court in Louisiana, federal court in Texas, and they were, after a lot more discovery, they were lined up to go to trial. Our trial was the first trial. A subgroup of our plaintiffs, 5 plaintiffs. We had a 5-week trial, and the jury delivered a verdict of $14 million for the plaintiffs, for the first 5 plaintiffs. Signal saw the writing on the wall. They were looking at, okay, $14 million for 5 plaintiffs, 250 people coming to trial. And I should mention that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission also filed their own lawsuit against Signal on behalf of the same group of workers because of the discrimination that occurred, the anti-Indian discrimination that occurred there. Signal filed for bankruptcy. I'll just have another minute. Signal filed for bankruptcy, seeing the writing on the wall, and through the bankruptcy, we ultimately settled the case for all the workers with this tremendous collaboration from all these law firms and the EEOC for between $20 and $22 million, depending how long the payout period lasts. Signal also wrote an apology letter to the workers. They had denied that they had done anything wrong up until this point. So it was very powerful for our clients to finally have a recognition from Signal that they had, in fact, not behaved as they should have. And Signal no longer exists as a company. So essentially, this case put Signal out of business.
But I think, thank you so much, Dan. Again, I just love that story. You're my Aaron Brockovich. So, but Dan's story illustrates, right, that these men had families depending on them. They couldn't go home because they were in debt and they were going to be embarrassed and ashamed. They had been lied to. Recruiters are another warning sign of trafficking. The worker having to pay fees to get the job as a sign, and living where you work. So those are just things to keep in mind. And also his case illustrates how challenging forced labor cases are to bring criminally, and you had to proceed civilly. Thank you all for your time. I hope we raised your awareness about labor trafficking.
And don't forget that there are resources. Again, there's a labor fact sheet that's included. There's information on the T visa and certification, and there's an overview of labor trafficking, as well as a list of resources here in Georgia for victims in case you come across them.
And there are a lot of documents on the Signal case also that have been uploaded, including the terrific jury instructions that I mentioned.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
We'll quickly